I just want to say very briefly, thank you very much for inviting both of us to this discussion. It's doubly convenient for me in a way, partly because I live about 5 minutes walk from here, but also because I'm trying to write a book at the moment about post-war immigration and many of the debates around it. So I have been reading quite a lot of my multiculturalism texts in the last few months. And as I've read those texts, a number of questions have popped into my head that I thought I'd like to ask Tarek. So I'm very lucky that he's sitting to my left. I'm going to say, as a sort of practice, one of the problems I have actually with a lot of the academic literature on multiculturalism is that it is often very abstract. And I was going to say that we should do our best, both up here and when you contribute, to be as concrete as possible. And that's often easier said than done. We are talking about sort of big abstract things all the time. Although having said that, when I came in and looked around the room, it does look as if quite a lot of you have done at least one PhD in multiculturalism. So perhaps we can allow ourselves to be a little bit abstract. Anyway, I was going to offer Tariq the opportunity to get the ball rolling by describing, really just in 2, 3, possibly 4 minutes, do a little introductory spiel, partly on really just a very brief historical overview. Tariq had been involved in the debate about multiculturalism in Britain probably since the early 1980s. Mid-1980s? Late 80s, okay. And obviously it's been through great changes in that time, just in the last year or two as well. So if Tariq would present as a brief historical overview, I think we're sounding rather far away. It's all right. And link that historical context with his very latest thoughts, which some of you will have seen in this British Academy pamphlet called Post-Immigration, Difference and Integration. So if Tariq starts with that general introduction, then I will start asking him questions and present my own somewhat different view of multiculturalism. So why don't you kick off?
Thank you. Well, I'd like to start by taking the opportunity to thank the Dialogue Society for hosting this event, for inviting me, and for all of you for being here. So to answer David's question, saying a little bit about the history of multiculturalism, how we got it, is that better than what was before? Is that better? Yeah. So, the history of multiculturalism. Well, if we focus specifically on Britain and leave out the history that involves Canada and Australia and the United States and so on, I would say that the history of multiculturalism very much begins with issues to do with anti-racism, racial equality, and anti-discrimination. Because the central issue in what has come to be called multiculturalism, wasn't always called that at the time, is the fact of what I call difference, which of course isn't a term I've made up, borrowed it from other people, so it's a general term. So, meaning that some people are identified as being in some significant respect different from the rest of the population. But they're not different in terms of being eccentric. They're different because of their membership of a group or groups of a particular kind. What kind? Well, not groups based on economic status or what they earn, but groups based on their appearance, in particular, racial phenotypical type appearance, their descent, cultural membership of groups, and related to that then religious affiliation. And the groups that we're all interested in, that in Britain we understand in terms of multiculturalism, are groups formed in Britain as a result of immigration, and specifically really post-colonial immigration. The people who came to Britain were people who already had a historic relationship with the British state and with British history. So, as I say, the first things that were done, having identified some people as different, was to recognize that there was discrimination against them in the labour markets, in getting accommodation, actually in so many different areas of British society. And some people denied it, but a consensus built up that it existed and that something should be done about it. So we began to have anti-discrimination rules and so on. In the 1980s, some groups of people, particularly those from South Asia, began to participate in various aspects of British life, including in politics, but public affairs more generally, and began to assert their sense of who they were, which to some extent they were being invited to do by certainly prominent parts of British society, and began to assert an identity that wasn't simply what we might call racial. It wasn't simply to do with biological descent. It had to do with heritage and a sense of community. And so we began to talk about ethnicity and ethnic minorities as a better way of conceptualizing the difference in question rather than race. In 1988, 1989, an enormous conflict erupted in Britain over the novel The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie. And that was an event that galvanized many Muslims and thrust them, or they thrust themselves, into the attention of their fellow citizens in Britain and, for that matter, on an international scale as well, expressing anger against that novel. Now, leaving aside the rights and wrongs of that clearly was a phase, a new phase in this history of multiculturalism, because it made religion in general, and Muslims specifically, more central than it had been up to then. It wasn't totally unprecedented. Some of you will know that the Sikh turban campaigns in the 1960s and 70s, which actually led to legislation to, for instance, Sikh male turban wearers being exempt from the legal requirement to wear a motorcycle helmet while on a motorcycle, for instance. So it wasn't like that religion suddenly erupted in minority-majority relations for the first time, but it's fair to say that it erupted on a scale and with a degree of controversy that was relatively unprecedented. And then in the 1990s, we meaning British society, we began to respond to this new Muslim assertiveness. And I'd say that it was an event that tended to divide multiculturalists. Some people who up to that point had thought of themselves as multiculturalists began to say, but multiculturalism is not for religious people. I thought we were celebrating, saris, samosas, and steel bands, not all these fundamentalists and bearded people demanding in very angry, loud voices that their identities should be respected. That was one half of the divide. The other half of the divide said, well, actually what they're asking for, some of it may be inappropriate and unwarrantable, but some of the things that they're asking for are no different to what groups defined by race and ethnicity, and for that matter, gender and sexuality, are asking for, namely a identity that is in various ways accommodated in institutions rather than excluded or marginalized. And I think that till at least the events of 2001, of which I don't just mean the attacks in the United States that we call 9/11, but also the riots in the northern towns and cities of England. Broadly speaking, that's what we had in the history of multiculturalism, the development of those two approaches. Those people who said multiculturalism is a secular dispensation. It is a secular political project, and of course they had a particular idea of what this meant, what secular meant. And those people who said the core idea of multiculturalism is the inclusion of people's identities as they understand them and as they wish to project them in public life, obviously within a liberal constitutionalist democratic framework. 9/11, of course, and prior to that the riots, brought us to a new phase in that some people thought, well, we've been emphasizing difference, and that may or may not be a good thing, but here are now some communities living cheek by jowl, especially in the northern towns like Bradford and Burnley and Oldham and so on, who seem to know nothing of each other, have very little contact, and actually quite a lot of hostility. And yet at the same time, wave after wave, issues kept becoming part of national debates that featured Muslims, often highly negatively. Scares about what Muslims were thinking, what they were doing, what they were wearing, what they were not doing, who they secretly supported, and so on. And so, in one way or another, Muslims became the center of the multiculturalist story, and have been so for at least, well, over a decade anyway. And Britain's not unique in this, but I'll just talk about Britain. And then to round off my 4 minutes, if I'm still within them, to connect it to this new publication, well, that serves a couple of purposes, but I think the history actually sets them up nicely. The publication is part of a bigger British Academy project where 7 or 8 of us came together, and our brief was, we were obviously given different topics, it's not all about multiculturalism, includes the economy, climate change, health policies and so on. We were asked, where do you think the current developments in society are taking us to, looking to the future, and whether our existing policy frameworks, not detailed policies, but policy frameworks, the way we understand the issues, are they adequate to where we're going, in your opinion? And so obviously my brief was to think about issues to do with migration and the minorities formed through migration. And one of the things I try to do is to challenge those people who think that multiculturalism has had a history but hasn't got a future. People who say multiculturalism is dead, that it's failed, it's good riddance to multiculturalism and so on. I do this by, first of all, challenging the opposition, the dichotomy that's supposed to exist between those people who favor integration and those people who favor multiculturalism, by arguing that multiculturalism is actually a mode of integration for the kind of difference, the relevant kind of difference, what I call post-immigration difference. Now, this is not an invention of mine, it's not any kind of new position. This is actually what all multiculturalists have argued. And when I say all multiculturalists, I mean, the intellectual and policy pioneers alike. Charles Taylor, Will Kinlocher, Bikku Parekh, Iris Young, and others. They all saw multiculturalism as a development of liberal democratic society faced with problems of difference. And so I, work within that general framework. I do suggest that there are other modes of integration as well. I identify 4. So multiculturalism is one of them, but assimilation is one. A mode of integration that I call individualist integration, and a mode that I call cosmopolitan. And my view is that each of these modes has something to be said for it. And they may be appropriate for certain kinds of time and place, or a certain, policy sphere. But the most important thing is that the people who are being asked to be party to integration, as it were, should have the freedom to choose one mode over another, or to choose more than one mode, to say, actually one mode works best when it comes to issues like workplace dress. Their assimilation makes a lot of sense. I'd like to wear a suit and tie just like everybody else in my office. But when it comes to issues to do with passing on some kind of religious heritage to children, then I think we need another kind of mode of integration. We need a mode of integration that recognizes that minority communities are being formed, minority religious communities are being formed, to whom we now need to give state support in relation to certain education, like schooling, or it could be some other educational goal. And so, what I really argue then is that multiculturalism is a mode of integration which has its own strengths, and its core strength, its key idea, is that it works to accommodate groups and group identities and not simply individuals. And I also suggest that Muslims are a very good case, though by no means an exclusive case, it's just the one I focus on, and the one I know best. Muslims in Britain and Western Europe are a good case of people who will not be integrated, and integration is obviously the goal, who will not be integrated without some degree of group recognition. That is to say, without multiculturalism. So multiculturalism has to be part of the integration toolkit.
Good. That was 5 times longer than the 4 minutes I gave.
Is that right?
Man.
Well, you asked my history as well.
Anyway, a very eloquent overview. Let me plunge straight in. Why should integration be a two-way street? This is an already existing political system, an already existing society. When immigrants come here, they know that they're coming to an already existing society. Why should, beyond the obvious things, equal rights, minority rights, things like that, take for granted, why should the system here adjust? Surely the overwhelming onus is on people that are coming here to fit in with the system that exists.
Well, I think as a matter of fact, migrants, their children, their grandchildren, so on, do most of the adjusting, do most of the changing. I mean, that's just a basic sociological fact. So nothing I say is against that or will change that. But if you have equality of citizenship, and of course integration means we're talking about citizens, we're not talking about temporary stayers or denizens or guest workers. If you're talking about equal citizenship, then citizens have equal rights and responsibilities, equal duties. So you can't give one group of citizens a special duty, namely the duty to integrate, that other citizens are not required to have. That is an unequal burden. So that begins to eat away at a conception of equal citizenship. Secondly, where there is discrimination against the people who are to be integrated and who want to integrate, then you have to attack that discrimination, which means reforming various kinds of institutions, which is exactly what British society has been trying to do. I mean, obviously, in the last few weeks, we've had the Metropolitan Police in the news because of the verdict of the Lawrence inquiry. So, you know, if people are to integrate, the Metropolitan Police has to be reformed so that the integration of people is possible.
But that's a different issue. I mean, obviously, the Metropolitan Police practices need to be reformed in various ways. But what you're saying is really quite extraordinary. What you're saying is that modern democratic societies do not, in a sense, belong to the majority that live in them. And because they don't have to undergo some sort of transformation or integration process, that they sort of must suffer for that. I mean, I think we do actually go, you know, almost immediately to the heart of the problem, and I do think that is how a lot of, you know, majority white British people see multiculturalism as a kind of imposition on them. Of course, that, you know, people are perfectly happy. Most sort of modern mainstream liberal people are perfectly happy to accept that people have equal rights, minorities have equal rights. But the idea that they should massively change, which is what you say. I mean, you know, and you know, every time I read a multiculturalism text, it's always about the two-way street. The majority of the society must adapt. I come back to it. Why should they? You know, this is democratic sovereignty means that they own the system.
Well, the democratic sovereignty is the sovereignty of citizens. So it's not the majority of citizens, but it's citizens as a whole, citizens as a body. That's why I said that if we're talking about citizens, we have to think about some kind of equality of, as it were, the burden to change, the burden to integrate.
But it's not
Moreover, when migrants come, they're not just labour. They're not just workers. So they bring with them, obviously, their cultural heritage, their identity. Now, they may want to escape from various things, that may be quite possible, and like any sensible people, they know that they will change over time, and above all, their children and grandchildren and so on will be very different to if they had not migrated. So they know that the act of migration is setting in motion a whole process of change. But then the receiving society, you know, British society, also knows that it's taking people on who are not just, as it were, empty ciphers who accept any identity that's on offer. So both parties know they're talking about people with not fixed identities, but people with certain sorts of character. And the adaptation, therefore, is, as it were, the dialogue, the place we're in, the dialogue between these different characters, one of whom will be grossly more numerically larger than the other, and will have command over, you know, institutions and infrastructure and so on. So, yes, it's a two-way street, but it's not like the society, the settled society is going to change in anything like the degree to which migrants and their descendants do.
Yeah, as I say, I think this does go to the heart of the multiculturalism problem in a way. And if I can just give my own sort of alternative history, I think rather than four versions of integration or multiculturalism story that you described, I think there's essentially two, and it's pretty simple really. It comes down to a form of liberal multiculturalism, the kind that stood behind the Race Relations Act, the Roy Jenkins period of the 60s and 70s. Essentially colourblind liberalism, but with a ability to accommodate strongly felt group, religious, ethnic, differences. Sorry? What do you want to take us away? Right. Yeah, okay. Now, that, for all sorts of reasons, I don't think anything wrong with the underlying theory of it. I think liberal multiculturalism is what we should be returning to, and I think we are sort of gradually returning to it, actually. But it was seen as having failed. I mean, as you yourself said, Tarek, I mean, in the kind of late 70s, early 80s, sort of symbolised initially in a way by the GLC, what was happening at local government level, the shift from the belief that liberalism wasn't enough. It had to be much more aggressive and separatist. That instead of people being, citizens seeking equality, they were first and foremost the members of a minority, an ethnic or religious group, and that everything flowed from that. Political, even welfare functions flowed from that, and we've seen that in places like Bradford and Tower Hamlets, where you have to belong to the local mosque in order to get certain state welfare functions. We've seen politics descending into kind of block voting, and we shifted to a form of separatist multiculturalism in that period, and I think it was very damaging. It was done for the best of reasons, I think, but I think it had a very negative effect, and it was underpinned by this idea that separate identities should not only be allowed, but actually should be positively funded and promoted. So instead of having a women's group, you have a Black African women's group, a Sikh women's group, and so on. You had this all over the shop. I mean, you had Black and ethnic minority housing associations, something springing up everywhere in the mid-1980s, and one can understand why it happened. Liberal multiculturalism, I don't think it had failed, but British society was still a pretty tough place for minorities in the late 70s, early 80s, and it was sort of blamed for that. And another system was tried. And I think that system is now seen to have failed too. I mean, I think in the early 2000s, the race riots up north, 7/7, we're now readjusting from that. And I hope going back to a system where we see people as citizens first, and not having at least in the political sphere, there's people as citizens first and not members of an ethnic minority first.
Well, I disagree with just about everything you've just said, but obviously I can't pursue everything, so I'll kind of pick out what I take to be the main overarching idea linking various things you said, and that is that multiculturalism is about encouraging and funding separate identities. Well, I don't think so, and I don't think that's the practice of it, certainly not the theory of it. The emphasis on recognizing people's identities as opposed to just them being a blank citizen, just like everybody else type citizen, was because we could identify that some people were receiving discriminatory treatment or were being marginalized in certain kinds of ways. So the example you gave just now is about, funding something for black women. Because it was recognized that perhaps black women either weren't welcome, weren't included in some of the things that were available to citizens in general, or in the workplace in general, or sometimes for women specifically. And a lot of black women argued against feminists who they said were pretending to be colorblind, but actually thinking about woman in specific cultural and racial terms, usually a certain kind of white middle class woman. So most of the identification of whether it was racial or gender-based or some kind of ethno-religious based was because there was an identification that people were excluded And to bring them in, you had to first identify that they were excluded, admit that much, then target that exclusion. And all this time, you are pointing the finger at something rather than saying, oh, everything's the same. You are highlighting an identity. That's entirely true. Moreover, the identities that were being highlighted, like black or Muslim or anything like that, are identities which are not purely descriptive identities in the sense that they're lived identities. They're lived from the inside and not simply understood as sociological descriptions of what people are like. So the people who live these identities, black people in one example, Muslims in another, women in another, they want to have a say about what is being said or done in terms of various kinds of policies or provisions, like in welfare services, like in schooling and so on. So they want to see, in the ways that society is structured, in the way that society self-image is projected, they want to see something of themselves in those images. They don't want there to be a allegedly neutral conception of society, which won't be neutral, but will reflect, for very good reasons, will reflect a certain kind of historical majoritarian or possibly elitist view of society. So it's much better to argue for inclusion through explicitness, but that's not separateness, that's inclusion. It's inclusion through explicitness. That's the core thrust of the policies that you've been deriding.
No, I don't deride them, and I think there was a case for some autonomous organisation back in the 70s and the 80s, but I think what happened was that a sort of bureaucratic inertia set in, and indeed elements of self-interest amongst the groups that did have the funds from the GLC. I mean, I agree the funds involved weren't terribly large, but we're talking about an attitude of mind, which I think was the damaging thing, and continues to some extent to this day. We did lose sight in all of these arguments about the bigger picture of national citizenship, and I think a lot of multiculturalists would acknowledge this now, that multiculturalism was a very asymmetrical doctrine. It was very much in favour of promoting pride, confidence, and funding it on the part of minorities, but didn't really have anything to say at all to the majority, when it either thought that the majority's identity was unproblematic and fine, or possibly oppressive. Either way, it was not engaged with, and I think that that has been recognised, and there's been some rather belated reaction to it. But I mean, let me put to you this idea of the ethnicity paradox. I mean, it all sounds marvellous that the more you allow people to be separate and different, the more somehow people are going to embrace British national citizenship. This seems to run completely in the face of common sense. If there is no structure that encourages them to integrate, and indeed, what I'm suggesting is that separatist multiculturalism, and I'm not anti-multiculturalism, I'm making a distinction between liberal multiculturalism and separatist multiculturalism, which I think emerged in the early 80s. It was embodied in some ways by the Rushdie affair. And because we didn't, because we encouraged and allowed that separatism to develop at a time when it was sort of happening spontaneously anyway, when in the 80s and 90s a lot of minority groups were getting to a critical mass. You're getting a sort of tipping point in schools. Schools were going from being sort of 40% minority in certain areas to suddenly being 80 or 90%. We have, because we're a liberal country, people do, on the whole, congregate together in their different groups. We don't instruct people where to live. So residential segregation turns often into school segregation. And at a time when we should have been leaning against that, separatist multiculturalism, forged initially the GLC, embodied in the Rushdie affair, was reinforcing it. and I think it has been very damaging. And I think your ethnicity paradox is just wishful thinking. I don't think we have any evidence for it. It doesn't seem to be. It certainly hasn't happened in the Netherlands. It doesn't seem to be happening here. If anything, France proves the opposite. In France, where Muslims have a much less pious identity, as it were, they identify much more with the French nation state.
Well, I think that, the ethnicity paradox, some of you may not be familiar with this term, but it's that in order to achieve democratic integration, one has to allow, possibly support, minorities to express their minority ethnicity. So David's saying, well, this is counterproductive and it hasn't happened.
I'm not saying they should express their minority ethnicity.
Okay, well, perhaps you have a chance to say that. I agree with a lot of what you said. It's just you take it and add things to it, which I would want to now subtract. I'm against separatist multiculturalism as well, so that's good, but I don't see that the choices are between liberal multiculturalism as you define it, and which is perhaps a little bit more like what I call cosmopolitanism in the British Academy booklet. And anyway, so I would want to offer a view of multiculturalism which is thicker than what you understand as liberal multiculturalism, but which clearly isn't, as I see it, a separatist. And as for whether there is any empirical evidence that allowing people, minority identities, facilitates integration, facilitates a sense of belonging, yes, there is evidence for this. There's evidence for it in this country, and there's evidence for it in Canada, and possibly and Australia. So that's at least 3 countries. In Canada, studies show, various kinds of survey-based studies as well as quantitative work, shows that people feel more Canadian and more patriotic about Canada and more have a greater sense of belonging to Canada where they feel that they are not where their minority identities based on family heritages, religious affiliation and so on are respected by Canadian society in a very public way. Some of that is to do with policies. A lot of it is very symbolic. As we all know, multiculturalism has a very large symbolic dimension to it. In this country, many surveys, 5, 6 surveys, and in this period where there's been this very sharp conflict with Muslims at the center of it, about are they British, are they loyal, what are their real sympathies and so on. 5 or 6 different surveys carried out by different organizations with different sampling methodologies and so on have found that Muslims are more likely to feel British and feel a sense of belonging to Britain than non-Muslims do. This is true in London, and it's true in England and Wales as a whole. So that's another example. And why do they feel this? One of the reasons they feel this is because they feel Britain gives them the freedom and the space to be Muslims. And European Muslims, when they're asked similar questions, say, actually, we'd like a bit more of what British Muslims have. They say that British Muslims are in the best position of Muslims in Western Europe. The bit that I agree with you is that I do think that British multiculturalism in practice and at the level of what we might say Guardian editorials was not sufficiently explicitly integrated, unlike, say, Canadian multiculturalism or Australian multiculturalism. I'd like to exempt myself from that generalization, that general point. Some of you will know that my very first set of writings on these topics were collected into a book called Not Easy Being British, in which I argued, almost not quite the very first person to do so, but certainly amongst the first 2 or 3 people to do so, that national identity was very important to the role of integration in a democratic, multicultural society, and that multiculturalism needed national identity and not merely abstract citizenship, liberal citizenship, or what Habermas, the German political philosopher, called constitutional patriotism. So at a time when everybody else, or nearly everybody else, was talking about evacuating or hollowing out national identity, I actually was saying we need national identity in order to achieve multiculturalism, because you can't just emphasize difference without emphasizing commonality. So I see that what's been happening in the last decade has not been a repudiation of multiculturalism, but a necessary rebalancing. And that's the bit I agree with you. It's just that I don't see that as leading to individualism only. It's certainly very consistent with individualism, and a lot of the individualism I'd want to support in various ways. Bearing in mind that I said at the start that I think that people, people who are to be integrated should have as much freedom to choose the mode of integration. So nothing wrong with assimilation if it's freely chosen. Nothing wrong with liberal individualism integration if it's freely chosen. But if there are some people for whom community membership, group identity, religious affiliation are important, then that too is something that they're entitled to. It is a normative and political fact that we have to build in to our conceptions of integration and our conceptions of national citizenship.
Yeah, I mean, you do deserve credit, Terry, for your work on national identity. I'm very happy to admit that. But just to clarify this point, I mean, the kind of liberal multiculturalism that I'm in favour of is, of course, completely happy with people expressing their minority identities, indeed their group identities. I mean, I think the problem emerges when this dominates the political sphere, when minority identities trump political citizenship. And I do think this does happen, particularly in our more segregated communities, in places like Bradford and Tower Hamlets, where your political identity, even parts of the welfare state, where you access through your religion or ethnicity. And I do think that is a very serious problem. And I think it's made worse by certain aspects of what I would call sort of hard or separatist multiculturalism. This idea, back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that the feeling that it wants to kind of deconstruct the state, that the liberal state is not good enough, and it must be rearranged to accommodate and reflect these presumably separate minority groups. Now, of course, I'm in favour as the next man or woman having lots of representation, as equal as possible. But that idea that that the Church of England, it's illegitimate for the dear old Church of England to have all these bishops in the House of Lords. Well, perhaps it is, but I mean the idea that all minority religions should have equal representation in the Church of England seems to me completely misconceived. I mean there is controversy here, and it does have a kind of core culture, however hard it might be to describe. And most people who come to this country partly because of it. And of course they want their minority rights, and most people want to fit in and do so very successfully. And I think part of this discussion about multiculturalism and the different accounts of it that one can give is partly a reflection of the very different experiences of very different minorities. But we use the metaphor of space quite a lot when we talk about multiculturalism, allowing people space. And I think it's a very useful metaphor in some ways. You can see how certain groups come here and over decades or generations even have used the space that a very liberal society has given them, in order to better launch themselves into this society. You know, the East African Asians, which are so successful, of course they came with much greater resources than some of the other groups, but Sikhs, Hindu Indians, you know, all the groups that we know have done well in education, in the labour market, they used that space to launch themselves into Britain, and other groups, partly encouraged, I would say, by hard separatist multiculturalism, have used the space to barricade themselves off from the rest of society. And this is the story you see in the Bradfords and the Tower Hamlets and parts of Leicester and Liverpool. And I think that is a real problem. And to just say that, oh, you know, when Muslims are asked whether they identify with Britain, and they say yes, that's fine, but they also say when asked that they identify, unlike French Muslims, they identify first as Muslim and second as British. And you know, and I'm afraid I discount any evidence from Canada on this point. I mean, the dear Canadians have always been desperately in search of an identity that separates them from their North American cousins to the south. And multiculturalism is one of the stories they like to tell each other to remind themselves that they're different to the Yanks. Anyway.
Well, you know, I'm not against the bishops in the House of Lords, but there's nothing liberal about that, so that's more a problem for you than for me. You used terms like you're worried about ethnicity trumping, dominating politics, but that's not what we have in this country. I'd be worried about that as well. You mentioned Tower Hamlets a couple of times. Let's look at that as an example. If we look at voting in Tower Hamlets, what is quite remarkable is that people have voted on issues. The Respect Party emerged because of the Iraq War, but people then returned to the Labour Party. They didn't just stay with what they saw as a marginal party. Bangladeshi origin candidates stood for a number of different parties. People didn't just say, oh, well, I'll vote for a Bangladeshi because I'm a Bangladeshi. That person comes from the same village or same country of origin as me or whatever. There are lots of cases up and down the country, but including in places like Tower Hamlets, where people have voted for a party whose, you know, general policy position they support, and not at all for someone of the same ethnicity or the same religious affiliation with them. One of the things that has happened in Tower Hamlets is that certain mosques, and in particular the East London Mosque, has emerged as a very strong civil society institution. A lot of welfare activities are either conducted through the East London Mosque or supported through the East London Mosque, or the East London Mosque is a resource that various welfare agencies and local authority use in order to reach people that they cannot use by themselves. And so the East London Mosque has become a local partner, a local civil society partner, in the way that churches are in various parts of the country, in the way that trade unions have been in various working class community centres or associations or neighbourhood associations have been. This is all part of the multi-layered level of a democratic society, which doesn't just simply consist of the state and individuals. It consists of a layer of institutions which mediate relationships between citizens and between sources of power and decision-making and the people that it affects and so on. And that is part of what we call democracy. And multiculturalism is one dimension of that kind of multi-layered mediation. What a conservative political philosopher, Edmund Burke, referred to as the little platoons that people belong to, rather than just belong to the state or the country. But that the little platoons are not separatists. The little platoons are linked to other little platoons. They overlap, they intersect, they harmonize across a number of factors. There are also, of course, oppositions and so on, but that's part of the texture of a democratic society. Of course, it's not all going to be harmony, but together, in their overlapping way, in their own synergistic way, they form the country that we are.
I think one of the problems here is that the little platoons are often led by extremely conservative lieutenants, or whoever it is that leads a platoon. Is it only a corporal? Okay. Well, I don't wish to demean the leaders of these little platoons with such a lowly rank. But and this is a real challenge, I think, for people like Tariq who come from the left, who support liberalism in all its forms, who support equality between men and women, and are opposed to homophobia. The truth is that the kind of the multiculturalists, particularly at the harder end of it, have been much more tolerant of the illiberalism of minorities than they have been of the illiberalism of the majority. This apparently liberal idea in the abstract of harder separatist multiculturalism has actually handed power over to some very, very conservative forces in a lot of our minority communities. And in the kind of debate between multiculturalism and liberalism, I don't think, as indeed in the debate between multiculturalism and national identity, I think Tariq, B.Q. Parek and others are on both sides of the argument, and I think they've got to make up their minds. I think to just give you an example of what I mean by kind of sort of ethnicity sort of swamping political citizenship. I went to Lozells a few months ago, it was just before the local elections last year, it was May. Lozells is a place that's had a lot of trouble, tension between African Caribbean, Black African, and Asian populations, South Asian populations. And understandably, people want to, I absolutely accept your sort of seeing yourself reflected in the political process issue, I think is completely legitimate. And they have a system whereby there's basically an agreement. It's obviously a Labour-run borough, and there is an agreement that there will always be an African Caribbean candidate, always be a Black African candidate, and always be a Pakistani candidate. And I have no problem with that. I went to the rally to elect all of these men, I think they were. It was the best attended Labour Party meeting that I've ever been to. About 400 people in the room. There were 2 women in the room. I was one of, I think, 4 white faces in the room. And this was the clan. This was the clan that had come out to vote for Pakistani guy. Now people say, well, what's wrong with that? Kind of Irish voting back in the early 20th century and all that. But I think there is a problem. This is now 3rd, 4th generation Kashmiri Pakistanis who are still voting in their ethnic bloc, and I think that harder multiculturalism has encouraged that, and I think it's a damaging thing for British politics. I'd be interested in what you think of that, and whether you think that is fine or not.
I'll say something about that, and then maybe just a closing remark about conservatives.
Yeah. Conservative corporals.
Conservative corporals, yes. Well, I think that democracy means citizens taking their duties seriously, which means paying attention to what's happening in politics, keeping yourself informed, and then, when it comes to things like voting, which is obviously an important civic duty, to consider the options before you in an informed way. So, voting for someone simply because they are part of your clan or country of origin is a very poor form of consideration, of democratic consideration. Of course, in a democracy, we count all votes equally. So the professor or the barrister that studied the whole manifestos and so on, that person only has one vote, just like everybody else who doesn't even know what they're voting for, maybe, influenced by the last thing that they saw on TV. but we count their votes equally. We look to the democratic process as a whole to educate and to mature judgment. And I think that the examples you've chosen are cases of very poor democratic practice, but I'd like to think that through participation, and this is a bit like the ethnicity paradox, through participation, people move on from their most immature participation into more serious consideration. About the conservative corporals and conservative mullahs and so on. Well, I've already said I don't have a problem with Anglican bishops in the House of Lords and so on. So, there will be conservative Muslims, there'll be conservative Hindus, conservative Catholics, and so on. I may not share their views on a number of matters. Where there is no, discrimination or stigmatization or encouragement of prejudice, and obviously where there's no violation against people, I think we have to allow people those kinds of views. Some communities perhaps will be conservative, either for a period of time or for that matter for a long period of time. But conservative people are as much entitled to be part of multiculturalism as liberal individualists. And we can't say to people, you've got to be a bit more liberal before we can include you under multiculturalism. I think that...
Well, that begs the question, doesn't it, about what the kind of core liberal rules are. I mean, is it all right for a conservative mullah to say girls can't learn science? Like that? Not to mention the more extremes of them.
Well, when you say right to say it, of course...
Or to practice it.
In what way? To advise other people of that?
Yeah, or say in a Muslim private school.
I think people should challenge that view. And indeed they do. And one of the things that's actually been emerging over the last decade is the growth in the confidence and the organization and the general timber of debate amongst non-conservative Muslims, who of course usually didn't have levers of power or authority easily at hand, at the beginning of the last decade, but who now, especially amongst younger people, are saying, we too are Muslims and we don't want to be defined in terms of who we are and our sense of being Muslims and our reading of Islam by other people who do not share our views or understand about our lives. And that is part of multicultural democratic debates. But people are entitled to those conservative views. I would want to challenge them. I would encourage and support other people to challenge them.
Good. Well, we've had a generous 5 minutes winding up, at least this stage. So we're going to have questions and comments now.
Thank you very much. That was a very fascinating discussion. I would like now to open the floor to any questions you may have. We have a 35-minute Q&A session now. So if you'd like to put your hand up if you have any questions. Thank you.
Professor Madood, you used the word historical majoritarianism at one stage. With the exception of one comment that David made, it seems that not only was sex invented in the 60s, but apparently history too. Because what seems to be ignored totally is that Britain has, for centuries, been a country that has accepted minorities. And we also have a very big minority. The estimates are there are between 4 and 6 million Catholics, not all of whom go to church, who have been suffering exactly the things that you say Muslims suffer for 500 years. I'm Catholic. Are Catholics loyal? Are they really British? And the expression you used were, are they giving secret support to somebody? Catholics, and I've had this in Scotland very recently, I'm very worried about Scottish separatism. because it'll all kick off in Scotland. It's a very sectarian country, and it's totally ignored the history that goes with Catholicism. It should be looked at in conjunction with the history of the way Islam is being looked at now, and multiculturalism. And also, David mentioned the different attitude of Muslims in France. Is that not an accident of history? Because French communism treated as the cut on of France, but it hasn't stopped the banlieue kicking off. And large minorities in the banlieue really rioting. And if there were Olympic gold car burning activities, they probably win gold medals for it every time.
Yeah. Do we answer those?
Yes.
Thank you. Those are two very good points. Starting with the last one first. I mean, David was pointing to, France, something happening good in France. I'm not sure exactly how much good he thought there was. He just gave the one instance of that French Muslims are unlikely to say they're Muslims first and French second. So I don't know whether we think other things that have happened in relation to French, as it were, minority integration is good or bad. But the French themselves think their policies have failed, just as to some extent we do in Britain and people do in the Netherlands and in Germany and so on. So I think the sense that integration is not working, something isn't working, something has gone wrong, is shared across, if not the whole continent, certainly Western Europe, and is not confined to countries that identify themselves as multiculturalist or pursue multiculturalist policies, because in many ways things are actually worse in France in terms of levels of discrimination, in terms of job opportunities, in terms of representation in public civic life, people who you will see discussing things on TV and so on. Things are worse in France than they are in the UK. On the point about Catholics, yes, I think there are parallels, both in recent history and longer term history, because obviously you could, the stuff about disloyal and taking their orders from someone abroad and so on. I mean, obviously, there's Guy Fawkes and the attempt at Parliament and the burning of Guy Fawkes ever since as a commemoration of that. But also more recent history, the experience of Irish Catholics who migrated at various times since say for over the last 125, 150 years.
Point of order, as an English Catholic, you go to the average Catholic church, which is the minority majority, and you will be discriminated.
Right, okay, well, I don't know much about that, but I do know that some of the issues that are discussed today in relation to Muslims, like loyalty to the state, like schooling provision, like issues about conservatism and so on, and even gender difference, role difference between men and women and so on, are issues that have been discussed in relation to Catholics, both more recently and further back.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this was the sort of preface to modern discussions of multiculturalism. Now we talk about Sikh turbans and halal and things like that. But the kind of the trial run for modern multiculturalism in some ways was the Protestant Catholic argument over many centuries, which was, was in a sense resolved in the 19th century through what was then the sort of the high point of radicalism, which was minority rights. I mean, Catholics did not demand equal representation with Protestants; they just wanted the right to be Catholics. And after long and bitter struggles, they got that. Can't you?
No, you can't. You can't be monarch.
Yeah, I think
You
every
could
prime
be
minister-
married to a monarch.
You
Yeah.
can't be prime minister either. You could be a Muslim prime minister with Hajj prime minister. You still cannot be a Catholic prime minister. Why do you for that conservative Archbishop of prime minister?
Have we had a Jewish prime minister?
Yes.
Well, convert. He wasn't. He was a convert. Yeah, but he was of Jewish heritage. I think we. Just on the French point too. I don't, by the way, believe the sort of we're a mongrel people. We've always had lots of immigrants. So what's the trouble? Actually, between 1066 and about 1950, we had, excluding the Irish. No, I mean that is quite a big exclusion, but for quite a lot of that time, they were actually part of the same state. We've had 150,000 Huguenots, slightly smaller number of Jews in the 19th century. We've had an absolutely trivial. Britain was an incredibly, ethnically homogeneous place actually in 1945. It's a part of the sort of immigrationist narrative that just on the French thing very briefly. I think I don't think any system particularly worked any better than the other. Indeed, I think we enormously exaggerate the effect of the sort of big picture. We're multicultural Britain, their assimilationist France. Actually, you compare the lived experience of being Turk in Berlin, Moroccan in the film years of Paris, Kashmiri Pakistani in Blackburn. In many ways, in their different national contexts, I think experiences were really very similar. And what they all have in common, or at least certainly the French and British examples, is that people came from very, very different, pre-modern, in many cases, traditionalist societies. It was an extraordinary act of generosity in some ways. Okay, you may say it was kind of repayment for empire, but between 1948 and 1962, we had an open door policy in saying that we now have the European Union. Nobody, Randall Hansen, his father's book, has read all of the, we had this thing in 1948 called the United Nationality Act, which effectively opened the doors to 400 or 600 million people, everybody in the empire basically, or the recently ex-empire of India and Pakistan. He's read through all the debates about it, and not a single MP or peer thought that anybody might come, commented on the fact that if you open the doors to 400 million people, then a few people might turn up. And over that period, 500,000 people did turn up, and they were mainly, not to put too fine a point on it, peasants. They were working class people, mainly working class people from the Caribbean, or they were small farmers from Punjab or Kashmir. They came from very, very different places. But because of the myth of the imperial family, we didn't attempt to integrate people. We sort of thought, we know these chaps, they're jolly good big Sikh fellows who fought for us in India. We don't need to sort of help them learn English or anything. So they came and they made their own way, and with great difficulty sometimes. And that was, I think, our sort of historic sort of sin of post-war immigration policy was to imagine that everybody would just get along fine and that we didn't need to do anything as a liberal state.
Sorry to intervene.
I've got
just try to keep questions as brief as possible. I'm just wary of time.
Point of order information. Look, as the SS Empire Windrush made its way to these shores, there were fierce debates in Parliament. Even Labour MPs sort of started saying that open door policies were introducing the race question into British society, and that Britain wasn't ready for this kind of huge amount of debates which were going on. All you have to do
That came a bit later.
This is as the Empire Windrush as was coming in. Look at the parliamentary debate. This is being well covered.
There were comments made by people in Whitehall. In the debates on the 1948 Nationality Act, there was no mention of that.
The 1948 Nationality Act, there was considerable opposition from the Tory benches to the 1948 opposition. On top of that, in the late 40s, there were people, also in Whitehall, as you're aware, sort of sending memos saying, how can we, if you promote these dark chappies, how can they work under the same roof with English women? And this is rampant racism. One. Two. the
Sorry, we
model.
have questions, please.
I'm making a statement. I'm just the factual statement. The model, which was like the Gastarbeiter, people were bringing for various reasons from the Caribbean, which was English-speaking, Christian, and lived under the empire. They were coming here as they did during the war to serve and then go back. In fact, many people said that they wouldn't last the winter of 1948 in this country. So that was the second thing. And the third thing, of course, was cheap labor. And then the whole of Europe, Reconstruction was opening doors. And they were regarded as more pliable, and hence the Poles and the other displaced persons who flooded in, as you know, into this country in 45, 46, wouldn't do those jobs, and they were asked to leave. So it was the Commonwealth more pliable, more socialized.
To leave.
Well, they were encouraged and various things. So I think you should really look into your own history, right?
These are technical historical.
There's not technical.
But one thing I do dispute. I mean, it's a great myth. You know, it's not only majority populations that have myths; minorities have myths too. I've been travelling around the country. The myth of invitation, the idea that Britain went out and invited half a million people to come here, is not true. People came because they could, and because they could earn good money. And there's nothing wrong with that, but there was, with the partial exception of the textile employers in the north, who did actually go and try and find to recruit labour, there was no, we had Ireland. We actually didn't need people from the colonies. We had the reserve army of labour called Ireland. More people.
Mr. Goodall, we teach those things in the first semester of our race relations module, so, you know, let's leave it at that.
Yeah,
Thank you. We have a question at the back, gentleman back there.
Thanks. I've got a question for David. I think David knows me well enough to know that we disagree quite a lot, but I'm just interested, when David says he's opposed to secessionists or separatist multiculturalism, I wonder what precise policies or theories does he have in his sights? I can't think of an explicit policy, be it in Britain or Canada, perhaps in the Netherlands, but I can't think of one in Britain or Canada or Australia that would promote separatism. I can think of perhaps the fact that there might be inadvertent effects that work that way, but I can also think about the fact that it would be a non sequitur to go from inadvertent effects to being that multiculturalism is always bad, or that multiculturalism is always separatist, because you can rectify problems as well. So I wonder, what precisely, in terms of policies, what exactly have you got in your sights? Maybe it's a theory, but then the question becomes, which theories do you have in your sights? Can I, one more question. You said at one stage that you thought that why should multiculturalism be a two-way process? Why should integration, be a two-way process? And the next thing that you said was, well, gosh, does that mean that the country no longer belongs to the majority? Now, that automatically makes me think, well, how would you defend the proposition that the country doesn't belong to all of its citizens? Because surely in any democracy, that's what most people would think, and most people would want to defend. And as soon as you accept that, a logical corollary of that is to say that all citizens have the duty to integrate. But at some point, I suspect in your logic, you think that the country only belongs to the cultural majority. And not only from there can you say, well, it's all the effort must be placed on minorities. As soon as you accept the point that the country belongs to the cultural majority and to minorities, then it becomes the case that you have to accept that all have a duty to integrate. So how would you defend this position?
Of course I believe that the country belongs to the cultural majority and to minorities. I mean, but the question is, what flows from that? You know, does that mean that the cultural majority has to completely rearrange its political system in order to accommodate the minority, or is minority rights and equality before the law and all those kinds of things sufficient? And I would say, broadly speaking, the latter. That because Britain is English speaking, because the Anglican Church has historically been the official religion, that somehow all of these things discriminate against the minority. I don't think they do. People come here with open eyes. They know it's a different country from one they came from. Are you suggesting that the English language not be, spoken everywhere?
No, I think the power relationship that Tarek describes more than adequately illustrates why the predominant emphasis will always be on cultural minorities.
Yeah.
But that's just a power relationship. The question becomes, morally, what would be the argument that you would use to suggest that the cultural majority have no role in adapting?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what you're expecting the cultural majority to integrate into. They're already here. It's their society that kind of contract between generations. I think this is one of the problems with harder multiculturalism. It is trying to kind of impose sort of a form of extraterritoriality, to use the legal jargon. And I do think that, and I think that is a particular problem with Muslim minorities that want to impose, minority rules on the majority. We saw it most dramatically in the Rushdie affair. A group of Muslims in the north of England wanted to impose different rules on free speech on the British people. That is what they wanted the book to be
that
banned.
the blasphemy law that applied to the Christian faith should be extended to protect the Muslim faith. They wanted a consistent application.
But historically, this has not been a Muslim country. It then had a very small Muslim minority. Should that extraterritoriality have been granted?
This comes back to the fact that you seem to think that this country belongs to the cultural majority.
It belongs to the majority. Yeah.
Right. So you don't believe that it belongs to all citizens. So what you said a few minutes ago
you don't seem to
doesn't
accept that
stand.
one can have
It's
a
one or
country
the
that
other,
is dominated by a cultural majority, but affords equality to its minorities. What's so complicated about that? You're demanding too much, in effect. You are. You're demanding that the whole system change to accommodate a small minority.
No,
we're
demanding that there be dialogue. We're demanding that some of these changes, for example, turban wearing Sikhs being able to ride a motorcycle without a helmet. We think that some of these things make no impact on anyone.
It was a bit of historic English common law. It was the religious consequence aspect of English common law that allowed that change. I'm very glad it did. I think it's perfectly reasonable and a good example of a liberal multiculturalist sort of capaciousness. I do think that Tariq and Miku and perhaps you too, Baron, have underestimate the flexibility of liberal multiculturalism. That we don't need to have the separateness, which I think flows from the harder form of multiculturalism, in order to have minorities who are absolutely comfortable and have, in effect, the same rights as the majority in things that matter. They can't change the flag and who sits in the House of Lords. Well, that shouldn't be happening anyway. But just very briefly, your point about, I agree, you're right that on being concrete, as I said at the beginning, what are actually the concrete things to do with separatism? Well, I'll name a few. I think it's not that there was national policy, as you know better than me. Multiculturalism doesn't have national policy. It didn't happen at national level and all this stuff. Indeed, national governments, to their shame in some ways, abdicated all this to local government in the 1780s. This was abdicated effectively to local government and the left, actually. It was abdicated to Ken Livingstone and others. And so what we're often talking about is a frame of mind. It is organisational things, like funding and supporting separate groups, breaking everybody down into the ethnic block and funding everything separately. Ted Cantle was complaining about this still, 30 years on, but this was one of the reasons why people in the northern towns were so aggravated, because the Asian could see the white people getting their funding and so on. You did have a lot of that. You have the whole issue of language. Are we encouraging people to speak English, or are we funding a separate language? Well,
saying people, of course, they should be allowed to live in their separate languages. I mean, that was a very specific policy part of multiculturalism. And the example I gave, things like BME housing associations. Some of these things, I think, were justified. Black sections in the Labour Party or the NUJ. Was that such a disaster? No. I mean, I think some people needed, a period of autonomy in order to build up their confidence. My point is that there was a bureaucratic inertia and self-interest kept these organisations, these separate organisations, going when all they've done is promote separation.
Thank you very much, David. We have a question at the back there, followed by this lovely lady at the front. Good. The back there, please.
Igor Kahraman, co-director for the Dialogue Society. I'd just like to share an extract from a letter that the Dialogue Society received from a member of the House of Lords, whose name I won't mention, and then I'd like to invite your thoughts and comments on that extract. It reads, I regard the concept of multiculturalism as inherently absurd. A society is defined by its culture, and it cannot be defined in two mutually exclusive ways. One culture must be dominant. If the older established or host culture defers to the new minority culture, it will sooner or later be destroyed. Here, it requires the majority culture to make it plain in words and deeds that it will remain dominant and shape society to that culture. The minority culture should be tolerated and accommodated, but no more, and given no statutory privileges or exemptions. Finally, the majority culture must examine itself and consider whether it has the will to survive.
Is that directed at
Both.
Well, actually, this isn't very different from what Baron Burrow at the back was raising about cultural majority and minorities. So I completely disagree with that view. I think that the way it started off, it probably divided society in a more rigid way than I would, or I think in general would be true of British society. I don't think actually there is a majority that exists and demands certain things. I think there are various kinds of overlapping majorities, some of which include some minorities, and sometimes various majorities become minorities themselves. I mean, case about Catholics, for instance, or the Irish is a very good example. Are they part of the majority or are they part of a minority? A lot of Jewish people in this country think they're a minority. Is that right, or are they part of the majority? But the point that Varun was making was that in a democratic society, if we have equal citizenship, then society, the public space, the way it's structured, the way it debates issues, its kind of concerns, the stories that are told about who we are, where we're going, that those things have to be ones that minorities can help to shape and not simply be shaped by. So that puts dialogue at the heart of the process of societal integration and of societal adaptation into the future.
As part of my researches for my book, I have come across this quote from Tariq, which doesn't conflict with some of the things you've been implying, but I think that puts it perhaps rather more dramatically than you might have intended. You wrote that the English majority are privileged because they are dominant, and it is difficult to justify why this dominance should continue. I mean, that is exactly the kind of statement that terrifies people, and I think gives even liberal multiculturalism a bad name. The equal citizenship is perfectly capable of providing minorities with what they need to be full citizens, and I think we're underplaying the power of liberalism here. As Tariq was just implying then, the changes that the minorities are responsible for, and quite properly so,
need to be imposed on the majority in a way that frankly frightens people.
Okay, thank you very much. The young lady in the front here. I'm afraid we've only got time for 2 more questions following this lady, so track the time.
There were 3 other people. But your name is on it.
Just in case you didn't hear that, the quote that was attributed to me, which I didn't recognise as having written, was apparently not written by me.
Well, sorry, but Tariq's name is on the piece. There are 3 other people's names on it. So if you should have read it. If you disagree with it, you should have struck it out.
Hello, I'm Jamisha. I'm on the Master's Programme at King's. Just to sort of go back to the French debate, we kind of touched on it from different angles, and I think it's quite interesting that you brought up some of the surveys and statistics that show that French Muslims identify more with their nationality than perhaps other French people would. It's quite rightly mentioned that obviously there was lots of tensions that flared up in the banlieue, and perhaps they were to do with economic issues and being sort of isolated from the centre, and educational as well. In your opinions, why do you think then the headscarf debate was so divisive when this security question was brought up? I mean, there was a forum put online which allowed everyone in the French population to, and outside as well, to qualify their opinions on what do they think is national identity. And this was started by, Sarkozy at the time. Perhaps he was pandering for Front National votes, who knows? But what are your opinions on the headscarf debate? Why it flared up?
Well, I think you're running together 2 different issues and 2 different debates. So the headscarf debate started in some schools in just outside Paris in sort of 1988. It's actually quite coterminous with the Rushdie affair in Britain. So that was about, there were 3 girls in particular that were told by their head teacher that they either had to take their headscarves off or they must go home and not return to the school until they were willing to return without their headscarves. And the national debate, of course that did trigger off a national debate, there's no denying that. But the national debate that Sarkozy instituted was only last year, and that was in relation to the burqa, that's to say the full face covering and perhaps body covering. So those are 2 different debates. I think obviously they're connected, but the first one has nothing to do with security. Nobody ever said it had anything to do with security, and insofar as the security debate started with 9/11, this was 12, 13 years before 9/11. So, I suppose there are 2 dominant arguments in the literature, the non-French literature anyway. One is that this was some form of racism, a form of cultural racism, that people were objecting to people projecting Muslim identities simply because they were prejudiced against, they had an antipathy to Muslim identities. Or the alternative debate was that it was a reassertion of French Republican secularism, what they call laïcité, and that this is a universalist principled position and nothing to do with prejudice. I think actually both were motivating factors, and I don't think one would have seen a reassertion of laïcité to the degree that we did, because what we now have is a much stronger version of laïcité in France than existed, say, up to the 1980s. We wouldn't have had that without a specific anti-Muslim animus, and I don't think it's got anything specific to do with security.
Having said earlier that I think the differences are exaggerated between British and French, German and other traditions, and they clearly do exist, and I'm very much on the liberal British side. Of course, it all comes from our colonial traditions. We were much more hands-off colonialists in some ways, up to certain periods, ruling through local elites, and not trying to convert even the empire into British citizens, whereas the French on the whole were trying to convert their colonial equals into French republicans. And their history played out the way it had. As we said for both nations, there are things obviously said against it. But I do think it's left us in a somewhat stronger position. And I do think, having been very critical of a lot of Tarek and the harder multiculturalists, they call them that, said, I do think, that at least the groups that are capable of using the spaces that British multiculturalism has afforded them, I think, clearly coming to your own sense of a hybrid British identity is much better than feeling that you're being dragooned into those as the French sort of in theory does, but it doesn't. Better an army of volunteers than a consequence. And actually, I have to concede, I think there is something actually in the ethnic paradox. I think something.
I'm writing it down.
Only something. I also think that there is a bubble of wishful thinking. There are real conflicts there too. But yes, I think we're lucky in a sense to have our more liberal traditions where these issues are. I think it's perfectly legitimate Jack's rule to say that you prefer a woman to take that in regard or speaking to her. That the fact that we have so little problem with headscarf buttons to our credit.
Thank you. You can have two very brief questions. The gentleman with the grey jumper, followed by John Cohen at the front, please. Thank you.
Way back up at college. Just asking David whether you think if minorities hadn't asserted their rights in the way that you allege, would the public sphere or the public square have enabled minorities to have any rights within a British context? What would be the alternative? And whether then have the assertion of those rights denied you or the so-called majority society their rights in any substantive way?
I don't think any of the changes that I've associated with our multiculturalism did change things very much. As I've said, I don't think all of them were bad at the time. As I say, black sections of the Labour Party within the UK gave you critical confidence. I don't think that was a problem. Essentially, we enjoy the rights that liberal multiculturalism provided us in the Race Relations Act or the Anti-Discrimination Act. Actually, all of the good things that that have eventually, of course, time and people getting used to minorities in their communities that help change things as much as anything else. But also, the legal framework. The Race Relations Acts were considered pretty radical at the time.
How did they come about? Because people had to struggle.
No, well, that's but they struggled in a liberal way for equal citizenship, not to cut themselves off and live separately, as the worst of the later phase I'm maintaining caused.
Perhaps I could just add to that one sentence, and that is, I agree with what was implicit in your question, William, that without the political assertiveness, and in particular without the organisation around anti-racism and shaming British society and British institutions about racism, some of these changes would never have happened. Having said that, these changes could never have happened simply by black and Asian people. White majorities had to be won over before these changes could take place. So we're in a country where minorities have to assert themselves for there to be change, and across Western Europe, British ethnic minorities are remarked, it's often remarked by academic commentators and others, how assertive British minorities are compared to France, Germany, Netherlands, and so on. But on the other hand, we have a political culture which allows that assertion, listens to it, and acts on it. So.
Thank you very much. Our final question, Jonathan, right at the front here, please.
Thank you, Jonathan Farrar, writer and broadcaster. I grew up as a child in the 1950s in a monoculture. There wasn't a single non-white child at my school. The shop shut at 5 and the food was appalling. Fast forward 50 years and it's a different world here in Britain. where it's sort of like going from black and white television to full colour, technicolor, on-wall, wide screen. All in all, don't both of you really accept that multiculturalism has made Britain a more exciting, more vibrant place to live in?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, this is if I may say so, a famously false use of the term. Multiculturalism is not the same as multiracialism and a multi-ethnic society. I mean, it's about the management of majority-minority relations, essentially, which is why I think people that are sceptical about certain aspects of multiculturalism, like I am, are often sort of put on the back foot, and you know, you have to defend the fact that you're in favour of a multiracial, of course I'm in favour of a multiracial society. And of course it's made Britain a livelier and more interesting place, but I think it's been managed very badly. I think we've made lots of mistakes, and it hasn't been looked at in a clear-eyed enough way. Partly, I think, if I may say so, because of the kind of implication of your question, which sort of slightly reflects what Professor Sari's steel band. Actually, Britain was a fantastically multicultural society in the 1950s. It may not have been racially and ethnically so, as the lady over there said. You know, we had the historic Protestant Catholic thing. We had these vast gulfs between different social classes. You know, you'd walk 3 streets from where you lived, you'd have gone into a completely different world, a completely different way of speaking, completely different attitudes to almost everything. You know, we were in that sense multiculturalists, is not to refer only to ethnic and racial difference, but we were, you know, we've been multicultural societies since we stopped being hunter-gatherers.
I mean, thank you for your question, which is like a kind of nice, sweet soft to me, and I can say yes to everything and so on. But actually, I'd like to kind of agree with what David has said, in that it's possible, and probably actually the case, that David can hold all the views that he does and still welcome a multicultural society. Multiracial society, okay. Well, all right. I mean, I personally think that, you know, when David Cameron made that speech about multiculturalism in Munich, right, okay, he too probably quite likes a multicultural society in many ways. I mean, I don't know that, but I don't say that he doesn't. And I'm willing to say that what I'm arguing for is more difficult than just an acceptance of a multicultural society, because I'm arguing for multiculturalism, which is more than just something that we arrive at through good fortune, through what some people have referred to as multicultural drift, just a kind of osmosis, organic process. And it's more than just, you know, cuisine and different kinds of clothes and different accents or colour skins and so on. Because I'm saying that those are good things. I mean, you know, all the things I've just listed, even if in a slightly sardonic, sarcastic voice, are all things I like and want to support. But multiculturalism is more than that. It is about recognition that fellow citizens have identities that are so important to them, either because of issues like faith and heritage, or because they are necessary in order to stand up against racism or other features of the minority condition. That without politically acknowledging those identities, we don't have equal citizenship. We don't have the same sense of belonging to this country. So multiculturalism is more than just a nice urban multicultural mix that certainly London takes for granted. And so I wouldn't want to hide behind just a celebration of everyday multiculturalism and pretend that that's all that I'm arguing for.
Can I just make a very, very quick final point? I mean, I think perhaps one of the points of difference between us is that, well, actually, there's not so much point of difference. It's much easier for majorities to accept the idea of minority rights and minority equality. Of course, it takes time, it takes laws, and it takes activism. But people sort of come around to it. It's not actually demanding a huge amount of majority, demanding recognition and demanding, you know, this sort of adaptation to is demanding a great deal more of the majority. And I think, and to call a spade, I mean, the group that is making that demand more than any other is certain aspects of the Muslim community. And I think if you're making a greater demand on the majority, Muslims are making a greater demand on the majority, and yet they seem to be, at least in certain manifestations, they seem to be the group that is least willing to adapt themselves to this society. So I think that is one way of looking at the Muslim problem. If you want to, there's a greater demand and there's a less willingness, because obviously it doesn't apply to all these groups, Turks, or it doesn't apply to Indian Muslims, all of them are doing well. I mean, this is often actually we're talking about national origins rather than a religion, and that's a separate subject. But I do think there is a problem here. That the greater demand has been made by the group that is least willing to budge itself. And Tariq talks about recognition. How do we know when we've done it? How do we know when recognition has been adequately supplied? How do we know when a demeaned identity is no longer demeaned? These are all very cloudy concepts. I'm not saying they're entirely useless, but this is very, very sort of abstract, and it's not giving us it's not giving us a concrete goal.
But you could say that about how do we know when we've got a healthy society? How do we know when we've got a healthy democracy? So, of course, multiculturalism is about laws and policies, but a lot of it is about respecting other people and respect takes the form of institutional inclusion, giving them a place. If they have distinct needs, being sensitive to those needs. Because in a way, what we're talking about are the terms of integration. Things like, what clothes do you have to take off before you can enter, as it were, the house of integration, the institutions of integration? Because David's just saying, well, he's all in favour of inclusion, but Muslims are demanding too much. But Muslims are saying certain things are important to us about being Muslims. And of course, Muslims have different views. I'm not saying they all hold the same view. But on the whole, Muslims want to demand the rights of fellow Muslims, even where they don't want to exercise those rights themselves, because they have a different way of being Muslim. And I don't think that in itself is unreasonable. In specific cases and at specific times, there might be certain things that some Muslim group or others demanding, usually a very small minority, that I wouldn't want to support, and that are taken up by national media and turned into national demands when they clearly are not. And, Bradford and Tower Hamlets, it's not the case that Muslims in these places don't want to integrate. They want to integrate. They indeed are integrating by measures of participation in the economy, participation in local community affairs, by speaking English, by joining things like the Labour Party. Often the segregation is not self-selective. It is just where people happen to live. And they happen to live often in the poorest areas.
Thank you very much.